All right. Well, thank you, Trudy. Let me add my welcome to all you folks joining us from the east to the west coast and all around our beautiful country. I am Subasati. I'm a volunteer community ambassador with the ARP here in Northern Virginia. From our earliest beginnings, ARP has championed lifelong learning. That's why ARP Virginia is thrilled to bring you our third year of Tuesday Explorers, a lifelong learning program offered every Tuesday from January through the end of April at 3 o'clock Eastern Time for curious explorers. For more than 60 years, AARP has been a wise friend and fierce defender, helping individuals to ensure that their money, health, and happiness live as long as they do. AARP has earned a reputation as a wise friend and fierce defender through trusted information, tools, and advocacy designed to protect the health and financial security of older Americans and empower them to choose how they live as they age. By promising to act as a wise friend and fierce defender, AARP is helping people who are 50 plus and their families feel confident, in control, and secure as they age. As a wise friend in your corner, AARP helps you protect yourself and your loved ones from fraud, get healthy and stay healthy, care for loved ones, make connections, plan a trip, learn new technologies, attend a class, and have fun like we are going to do today with our Tuesday Explorer program. I hope you will continue to take advantage of these opportunities and more. So it's now my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker, Blane Ampthor. Let me tell you a little bit about Blane. Some of you, of course, you know he's been with us last year, and he was already here with us 2 weeks ago. Blane Ampthor is a retired federal government employee with more than 36 years of service. A Philadelphia native, he has had a lifelong interest in history, particularly World War II, ocean liners, and the American Revolution. He enjoys visiting sites related to these subjects to learn about them in greater detail and to fully develop stories that he can use to educate audiences on important events. Blane, thanks for joining us today, and the screen is yours.
Okay, thank you, Suba and Trudy. So it's great to be back, and thank you for having me back. And thank you for all those who are out there watching and listening. So hopefully you'll find this an interesting presentation. I've given it a number of times, and people have really enjoyed it. And many people, especially the older crowd, let's just say that, can frequently relate to it a little bit. So to begin, this is a story of business, technology, competition, and the largest movement of people in the history of the world. It is a story of speed, a factor used to attract passengers, business, and prestige. And it's a story of a time that has passed, but which has significantly affected Europe and North America. The North Atlantic, which you see here on the top left map, is the world's most dangerous ocean. So that's the danger part of the title of this slide. It carries more traffic than any other ocean. So that represents the opportunity portion of the title on the slide. For more than 400 years, it has been the vital link between Europe and North America. Now, all ships in the world carry what's called a load line, indicating the limits for how much a ship can carry in various oceans, seasons, and even water conditions. Now, due to the sometimes extreme conditions, the North Atlantic is the only ocean that has its own designation, called Winter North Atlantic, the most dangerous time of the year. And on the lower left is that load line, which is also known as a Plimsoll line. And at the bottom there is Winter North Atlantic. As the ocean liner historian and author John Maxtone Graham stated about the Atlantic Ocean, the hazards read like a seasonal catalog from hell. So that's pretty vivid description. And in the center photo here, you can see a this ship here plowing through these heavy, dangerous seas. And to give you some perspective on that, that's a ship that's over 950 feet long. And on the right-hand side are two photos taken from another ship over 900 feet long. So it gives you an idea of the severity of the weather in the Atlantic, particularly during the wintertime. This combination of dangerous weather and opportunity for trade were the circumstances into which companies and countries entered a competition for a share of the commercial shipping opportunities. During the 1800s, ocean travel between the continents steadily improved with key features of regular departures, safety, and speed. So during this time, the early 1800s, travel had become reliable. During the first half of the 20th century, this competition for trade intensified and was influenced by technological developments. Ocean liners sailed to many destinations, but the majority of them crossed the North Atlantic by two courses of almost equal length, about 3,000 miles. The first was from England to North America, primarily New York City, and the second was from the Mediterranean, also to New York City. In order to be able to accurately record crossing times, official starting and finishing points existed. However, because the routes were not exactly the same distance, a ship's average speed was used to determine the fastest crossing. For the northern route from England to New York, the points were the Bishop Rock Lighthouse off the southwest coast of England to the Ambrose Lightship outside New York Harbor. And for the southern route, it was from the Gibraltar Lighthouse to the Ambrose Lightship off New York Harbor. Now, the blue riband, which is also known as the blue ribbon, is a mythical emblem of the fastest crossing of the Atlantic Ocean. It is commonly accepted that it began in 1838 with the ships Sirius, which you see on the top left, and the Great Western below it, which offered the first regular scheduled transatlantic service. So they were two key features. It was a regular departure and it was on a regular schedule. Previously, ships had sailed when they were fully loaded and sailed where needed. A regular service between two fixed locations was attractive to many people, particularly those with business interests. This fixed departure and arrival point was the origin of the word liner. Shipping companies often shied away from admitting interest in the speed record, since the negative impact or publicity of failing to achieve it was felt to be too great. However, all shipping lines knew the immense and intangible value of speed and of being the fastest. The Hales Trophy, which you see in the center of the screen, was created in 1935 when Harold Hales, who you see on the right side of the screen, a British politician and owner of Hales Brothers Shipping Company, created and donated the trophy to be a permanent, tangible symbol of the blue riband. Now, through the late 1800s, the speed title had been held by various ships from Great Britain and Germany. By the early 1900s, Germany had the fastest liners on the Atlantic. And the fastest German ships consisted of the Kaiser Wilhelm der Grosse, which you see on the top left, and the Deutschland, which is on the top right. Great Britain, a traditionally seafaring nation and a pioneer in Atlantic passenger travel, was behind in the competition for passengers, many of them immigrants. British prestige as well as commercial interests were at stake. With a government subsidy, the Cunard Line ordered 2 liners that became the fastest and largest ships in the world. And those 2 ships were on the lower left, the Lusitania, and on the lower right, the Mauretania. A Cunard, which most of us have heard of, was founded by this gentleman here on the bottom, Samuel Cunard, who actually wasn't even British. He emigrated from Canada to England and began a successful shipping company focusing on safety and reliability. And another major player in this field was a gentleman at the top, Albert Ballin, who was president of Germany's Hamburg America line. And he had inherited his father's immigration service, which allowed him not only to run the shipping company, but to focus on passenger care. Liners had relied on the steam expansion engine for their power and propulsion. And you can see on the top left photo here of one of these steam expansion engines, which were enormous machines. They were essentially a gigantic piston engine. And to give you an idea of the scale of these machines, you can see this man circled in the lower right, standing next to it. This reliable and time-tested engine had reached the end of its ability to provide high speeds due to efficiency limits within the engine and vibration that at the high revolutions needed to produce the high speeds. Now, this gentleman here in the top center is Sir Charles Parsons, who designed, construction, and tested the steam turbine, which was more efficient, smaller, had fewer moving parts, and produced higher speeds. And you can see an example of this steam turbine on the top right photo. Now, he tested his engine in the Turbinia, a small 100-foot vessel that he also designed and constructed. And you see a photo of the Turbinia on the lower middle. He demonstrated the potential of this engine in an audacious way by sneaking into and then speeding back and forth along the rows of Royal Navy ships that had been assembled for England's Diamond Jubilee celebration for Queen Victoria. And he zipped along back and forth along the rows of ships at unheard of speeds of 35 to 45 knots at a time when Royal Navy ships had top speeds of 16 to 20 knots. And you see a painting of that on the lower left. So I say he demonstrated this engine in an audacious way. So he basically crashed Queen Victoria's party. Now, this ship that he built, the Turbinia, actually survives today in Newcastle in Northeast England, and you see it there on the lower right. Parsons' turbine engine was tested on a few smaller liners, and based on the results, Cunard, a traditionally very conservative company, made the bold decision to install 4 of them on each of their new ships, a gamble they hoped would give them a decisive speed advantage. To distinguish the new Cunard ships, the Lusitania and the Mauretania, from their competition and to emphasize the technological advantages built into them, a steady release of interesting and astounding facts and features was produced for the general public. This tactic of gradually building interest had been a common advertising technique of shipping lines, but was particularly important due to the Cunard ship's advanced nature and big leap in size. To give an idea of the scale of the ships, photos of an anchor, which you see on the top left with a man beside it, one of the propellers on the lower left, again with a man beside it, and one of the turbines, which you see on the top right with an automobile beside it, were released to the public. Graphics of the capacities and supply needs of the ships also illustrated this point. And if you look in the center of the screen, the amount of coal needed for a crossing, which was a one-way trip, not a round trip. So just The amount of coal needed for a one-way trip was illustrated by the number of loaded railroad cars, 22 trains of 300 tons each. And the scale of the ships was shown by Cunard officials standing in the dry dock with the Mauretania. And you see that on the lower right. Now, Lusitania entered service first and captured the Blue Ribbon for the fastest crossing on her maiden voyage in September of 1907. And you see the Lusitania on the top left. Unfortunately, this ship is best known for being sunk on May 7, 1915 in World War I by a German submarine. And you see a painting of that on the lower left. Her sinking was a catalyst for the U.S. entry into the war. As the Mauretania departed for her sea trials before entering regular commercial service, the Turbinia was brought alongside for a historic photograph. And you can see this, the Turbinia here on the top right, circled beside the Mauretania. This photograph shows the application of Parsons' invention of the steam turbine on a large scale in a relatively short period of time, in less than a decade. So in less than a decade, his invention went from this little thing to this giant ship. Mauretania captured the Blue Ribbon in both directions on her own maiden voyage in November 1907, despite bad weather on the westbound crossing. And you see a painting of Mauretania on the lower right. During World War I, scores of liners were interrupted during a golden age of travel. And during the war, liners were used in several roles: armed merchant cruisers, troop transports, and hospital ships. The armed merchant cruiser was the least successful role since the ships required large logistic support to provide coal for fuel, and some of them were easily recognized by the enemy. However, some actually engaged in combat and were sunk, such as the Kaiser Wilhelm de Grosse, a former speed champion, which was sunk by the British cruiser HMS Highflyer. And you see a photo of, or a painting of the battle taking place on the top left. The ability of these ships to carry large numbers of people at high speeds led to roles as the troop transport, a role that was successful in moving troops to and from the Mediterranean. The hospital ship role was also successful, with ships such as the Aquitania, that you see on the lower left, and the Britannic on the top right. Now, the Britannic was sunk by a mine in the Aegean Sea, and you see on the lower right a painting of that taking place. An interesting personality involved with Britannic, as well as her two sister ships, is this woman here in the center, Violet Jessup. So these three ships, which were called the Olympic-class ships, consisted of the Olympic, and everybody knows the second ship, the Titanic, and then the third ship here, the Britannic. So Violet Jessup had been on the Olympic working as a stewardess when it collided with the British cruiser HMS Hawke. Both ships were damaged. However, there were no deaths and both ships were repaired. Now later, after transferring to the Titanic, Miss Jessup escaped only after being asked by an officer to get into a lifeboat as an example to non-English speaking passengers. She was handed an infant found abandoned nearby, held it all night in the lifeboat, then had it snatched from her by its mother when they boarded the rescue ship Carpathia. Later, she was a Red Cross worker, a nurse on Britannic, and escaped only after first feeding an ill nurse, helping her to a lifeboat, and then returning to her cabin to retrieve the one item she craved after the Titanic sank. And that one item was her toothbrush. And she spent a career at sea that lasted 42 years, working for various lines and on various ships. So if you found yourself on a ship with Miss Jessup and you knew who she was, you could either say something bad's going to happen, but we'll come out of it okay, because she seemed to have a knack for survival. Following World War I, the economies of Britain and Germany were in very bad shape, and few Europeans could afford to travel abroad. As a result, competing countries and shipping companies were not in a position to restart the speed race or to begin building large new ships. In addition, companies did not have all the ships that they had before the war, since they had lost ships through sinkings or the process of awarding ships to the victorious Allied countries in compensation for ships that they had lost. Other ships were interred at the start of the war and remained in various locations, such as the Chesapeake Bay, where 4 old German liners were tied up. And you see those ships on the top left. Because of the poor economic conditions in Europe, shipping lines sought American passengers because they had money resulting from an expanding economy, which had not been devastated during the war. The American class of traveler, during what became known as the Roaring '20s, created a golden age in transatlantic travel. Now, 2 events in the US, Prohibition, and you see 2 photos of Prohibition there in the center, and the Immigration Act of 1924, greatly influenced the business focus and marketing of the shipping lines. During Prohibition, American ships were dry, which resulted in American passengers often shifting to European lines. Even so, European ships had to be dry within 3 miles of the US coast. So you can imagine a kind of a comical situation that came about where thirsty American passengers who were leaving the US for Europe were just waiting to hit that 3-mile mark before they could have their first drink. And then the opposite, on the return trip to the US, they would make sure that they had that last drink as close to the 3-mile mark as they could. Now, the Immigration Act greatly restricted the number of Europeans, especially Eastern and Russian, that were able to come into the US. And you see some famous photos of immigrants on the deck of a ship and coming into New York Harbor with the Statue of Liberty behind it. Now, to give you an idea of the scale of this immigration, between 1880 and 1930, over 27 million people immigrated to the US. 12 million of them, almost half, came through Ellis Island. 1907 saw the most, with just over 1 million. Ellis Island processed as many as 5,000 passengers per day. These immigrants to Ellis Island all came by ocean liner. So that means that these ships were the means of history's largest migration. So without these ships, that migration would not have occurred. With immigration now restricted, nearly 1/3 of shipping companies' passengers disappeared. Therefore, a new focus on non-immigrant passengers began with a shifting of ship design to provide more luxurious cabins and amenities for those traveling for tourism and business. Marketing always played a large role in attracting passengers, but it was especially important during the immigration boom and afterwards when competition for passengers intensified due to the restrictions on immigration. And there were aspects of these ships other than their speed, such as luxury or comfort, which appealed to potential passengers. Marketing aimed to attract passengers to a certain line, a certain ship, or even a certain destination. So you can see here on the top left, the Cunard White Star Line advertisement, which featured this train, which allowed passengers to disembark from the ship and catch a certain train to certain destinations. And in the center is a famous poster from Cunard from the late 50s, early 60s, just advertising the line in general. And destinations were reinforced through advertising them, such as exotic places like South America. And you can see here on the left side, an advertisement for Rio de Janeiro. Societal images and notions were also emphasized, such as the young, independent traveling woman, by suggesting travel by this type of person was easily achieved. And you can see on the lower left for the Hamburg America line, this young woman traveling. Even the notion of a maiden voyage held appeal and was marketed, since a passenger could be part of a one-time event. And you see at the bottom here, advertisement for the maiden voyage of the United States. During the immigration boom, lines like Germany's Hapag went beyond marketing to make the immigration process easier and more complete by building a village, which you see on the top right, where immigrants could be housed, fed, and receive medical inspections before boarding a ship. This effort, initiated by Albert Ballon, who I mentioned earlier, also provided a complete process or a package for immigrants where they did not have to arrange each step of the voyage themselves, which had been the situation prior. Now, it was also in the interests of the lines that passengers be accepted into the US, since if a passenger was rejected, the line was responsible for paying that person's return voyage. And you can see here that village as it is today, which is actually a tourist area. Naturally, the prestige of sailing on the fastest ship held a large appeal to potential passengers who could choose from among many lines. Now, also during the 1920s, companies began converting their ships' fuel from coal to oil. Throughout the coal use era, minor strikes had been an ongoing issue affecting ship operations. Ships relied totally on a crew member called the stoker, who fed the furnaces, and this was a dirty, backbreaking, and dangerous job. All work was done by hand, from moving coal from the bunkers to the furnaces, shoveling coal into the furnaces, and maintaining them and the boilers. And you can see here on the top left a photo of one of these boiler rooms on a ship. And you can see here this guy is with the wheelbarrow is just unloaded a load of coal. So, and you can see them shoveling into the furnaces. And then on the right, the boilers, which produce the steam. And you can see, again, these were enormous things. And with these men standing in front of it, gives you an idea of the scale of these. And to give you an idea as well, is the Titanic had about 24 to 26 of these boilers. However, even though it was a manual job, the job of the stoker required specialized skills, and a good stoker was highly valued, sometimes earning more pay than other crew members. The stokers, or the Black Gang, as they were also known because they were covered with coal dust, were essential to the overall operation of the ship, providing all sources of power and propulsion. The introduction of oil fuel offered several advantages. Refueling became faster and cleaner. And if you look on the lower left here, you can see refueling a ship during the coal era. And what would happen is these barges loaded with coal would come alongside both sides of the ship, and 500-pound buckets of coal would be loaded and hoisted up onto these temporary platforms and then dumped into the coal chute, which filled up the coal bunkers. And so in this photo, you can see it looks like it's a pretty nice day. It looks like the sun is out and the workers are out there in their shirts. However, this operation had to go on all year. So it was winter, summer, heat, cold, rain, wind, snow, whatever. So again, another dangerous, dirty backbreaking job. Now, the introduction of oil fuel also allowed ships to maintain speed in bad weather, since the stokers no longer had to move and shovel coal on a pitching deck in rough seas. And oil fuel also vastly improved the safety of the stoker. So boiler rooms went from this on the top left to this on the lower right, from black gangs to engineers wearing white overalls. Now, following Prohibition and the Immigration Act, another major event hit the shipping industry, the Great Depression. Competition for passengers was intense during this time. Shipping lines turned to inexpensive trips such as cruises and marketing techniques such as trading on a ship's name and reputation to draw passengers to that vessel. The 1930s was a decade of consolidation and retirement of ships, since companies could not afford to operate as many ships as before, and since many ships were becoming old and outdated, having been built near the turn of the century. Famous ships such as the White Star Line's Olympic, sister ship to the Titanic, and a favorite of passengers, was retired and scrapped. And you can see on the lower left photo here, Olympic is tied up in Southampton, England, in preparation to go to the breakers. And so these ships would be taken to the breakers, and you can see two photos on the right. This is not Olympic, but a different ship, but where at the breakers, these ships would basically be taken apart. For surviving ships, sometimes alternate roles were found for them. For example, the famous Mauretania, which still had a very loyal customer base, was used for cruising and was marketed as the proud old speed champion, still rendering excellent service, which actually reflected reality because she still held the record for the fastest crossing since 1907. And she cruised from 1930 until she was retired in 1934. And the top left, you see her painted white for cruising. Now, Mauretania was so well known and recognized that people who had never seen her mourned the loss of this great ship when it was announced that she would be retired and scrapped. Upon her arrival at the breakers, a bagpiper stood on the pier and played a lament called The Last Post. And you see a photo of that in the center here, the bagpiper there, as Mauretania arrives at the breakers. Despite the bad economic circumstances and the retirement of many well-known ships, the Great Depression actually created the circumstances by which a new round of competition for passengers and speed would occur. Following the Great Depression, companies realized that fewer but larger and faster ships could meet passenger trade demands and reduce the number of ships needed, thereby reducing costs. The competition between Germany and Britain was rising again, as it had at the turn of the century. Germany demonstrated a remarkable economic recovery after the devastation of World War I and the Great Depression by building and launching not one, but two large express liners, the Bremen and Europa. And you see those two ships together on the top left. These ships were constructed simultaneously, with Bremen being launched just one day after Europa. Now, Germany had the audacious plan of having the ships cross together and having both of them capture the Blue Ribbon on their maiden voyages. So Germany was clearly after the speed record. However, Europa's completion was delayed by a fire. So Bremen made the voyage alone, capturing the speed title in July 1929 from the Mauretania, although Europa took the crown in March of 1930 and improved upon her own time in later voyages. Following Bremen's record crossing, in July 1929, Mauritania attempted to recapture the title. Though the advances of 2 decades of technology and ship design could not be overcome, she bettered her own time, scarcely falling short of the Bremen's new record by just 4 hours. In a testament to her design and operation, Mauritania had held the Atlantic speed record for an incredible 22 consecutive years out of her 29 years of service. Lines sought to add other features of speed, such as a catapult plane between the funnels of Bremen and Europa. And you see a photo of that in the top center. And the idea of this was to get the mail, which was a very important cargo for ships at this time, to the destination several hours ahead of the ship. However, this and similar ideas typically did not last. In 1933, a new participant entered the speed race, Italy. She built 2 large liners, the Rex and the Conte de Savoia. And you see the Rex on the lower left and the 2 ships there together in port. They were slightly different designs, but similar in size and speed. And both featured large Lido decks and pools on the stern, giving a Mediterranean feel to the ships and taking advantage of the warmer climate of the Mediterranean. And you can see here a photo of the stern of the ships, of the Rex here, with 2 swimming pools and this large open deck area. Now, the Rex took the speed record in August 1933 on the southern route, snatching it from Germany's Europa. When Bremen and Europa debuted, Britain and France were planning their next ships and passenger strategy. Cunard's aim was to build 2 large ships that could deliver a weekly service from each end of the Atlantic, instead of 3 or more ships doing the same. And in order to do this, to have a 2-ship service, this required speed, an average speed of 28.5 knots, which was almost 33 miles per hour, was needed for the entire voyage. France desired to build an equally large, fast, and luxurious ship that would trounce the competition. The size of these new ships was so great that they required the construction of new facilities, such as the King George V dry dock in Southampton, England, which was the 1,200 feet long and 135 feet wide, and the world's largest for 30 years. And you can see that King George V dry dock here on the left photo. And in the dry dock is the QE2, which is 963 feet long. And you can see there's plenty of space left over. Now, these ships also required accommodations at the other end of the Atlantic crossing in New York by extending inland the city's piers, since extending the piers into the Hudson River would have affected river traffic. So if you've ever been in New York or driven down the West Side Highway, you probably know it bends. And you can see this photo on the right-hand side, this big bend in the West Side Highway where the arrows are. And the reason the highway bends was to accommodate the extension of these piers. So these large construction efforts and huge investments in facilities illustrate the importance of these ships to ports and the business the ports wanted to retain. The 2 great ships that England and France envisioned were the Normandy of France, which you see in the top 2 photos, and the Queen Mary of England, which you see in the bottom 2 photos. The 2 largest ships in the world that would engage in a speed battle for the ages. These ships were linked from the beginning. Construction began on Queen Mary in December of 1930, while it began on Normandy just 1 month later. Due to the Great Depression, construction on Queen Mary was stopped for 2.5 years until a government loan was secured in exchange for the merger of the Canard and the White Star lines. Construction on Normandy continued, and she was the most expensive, most lavishly decorated, and most radically designed liner ever, completed as a masterpiece of the Art Deco style, opulence, streamlined design, and the embodiment of France and its culture. Normandy was the first 1,000-foot-long liner and the first to exceed 80,000 tons. Both ships were fast. As an author of a book on the Normandy described, imagine New York City's Chrysler Building cutting through the ocean at nearly 40 miles per hour. So that's a pretty good, vivid image to hold in your mind. When these ships entered service, they initiated a rivalry that encompassed companies, Canard of England and Transat of France, countries, England and France, and competition for passengers and prestige. This rivalry differed from competitions between other speed champions because they went into service within 1 year of each other and competed directly against each other, whereas previous record holders typically had usurped a speed champion that had been in service for several years. This made for an exciting drama. Their rivalry was the subject of news stories and was steadily reported, making for great publicity for both ships and their companies. Both ships were designed and decorated in the Art Deco style. Every design and furnishing on Normandy was new and unique, not relying on previous or existing styles, while the Queen Mary was more restrained and conservative. If you look at this photo on the top left, on Normandy, the main lounge, and you can see these images of the French countryside in the background. They had these Lalique lighting fixtures. The upholstery on the chairs was a tapestry type material, and the rug in the center of the room here was about 400 pounds. And the equivalent room on the Queen Mary on the top right, a little more conservative, a lot of use of wood, yet very luxurious. And if you go to the lower left, the first class dining area on Normandy, which was a room that was 305 feet long, 46 feet wide, 3 decks high, with a coffered ceiling. Again, these Lalique lighting fixtures, chandeliers here, hammered bronze, depictions of the French countryside, particularly the Normandy region. And it could seat about 700 people in one sitting. And then the equivalent room on the right-hand side, on the Queen Mary. Again, very large room, very well done, a little more restrained. And even their outward appearances at the top center is Normandy, very streamlined, very modern looking, very clean decks. Whereas below is Queen Mary, a little more traditional looking. So you could say Normandy was revolutionary. Queen Mary was evolutionary. And Normandy epitomized through style, design, and cuisine, the country and culture of France. Queen Mary epitomized the tradition and stability of British society and culture. Normandy took the speed record on her maiden voyage in May of 1935, despite having to slow for a time due to a minor mechanical issue. And again, despite companies and lines vigorously denying pursuit of the fastest crossing due to the potential negative publicity of failing to achieve it, Normandy broke out a 30-meter long blue ribbon, a meter for each knot of speed, and distributed special coins to commemorate her victory of the fastest crossing. So clearly, the French felt pretty confident that Normandy would take the speed record on her maiden voyage, which she did. Queen Mary did not take the record on her maiden voyage in May of 1936, having been slowed by fog. However, she did take the record in August of that year, but Normandy took it back in March of 1937 then improved upon her own time just 1 month later and became the first ship to break the 4-day crossing barrier. Queen Mary then took the record back in August of 1938, retaining it for 14 years. Both ships were stars in the 1930s, receiving extensive and constant news coverage, as well as capturing the cream of the Atlantic travel business. Unfortunately, war would intervene in this exciting rivalry. When World War II began in September 1939, Normandy and Queen Mary had just completed voyages to New York. For safety, both ships were ordered to stay there. In early 1940, remembering the significant role liners played in World War I, the British government and Cunard decided that the just completed Queen Elizabeth, the largest liner in the world, could not remain in home waters and risk being destroyed. In a secretive and daring deception indicating the ship would arrive at Southampton, Queen Elizabeth left her builders in Scotland and headed west at high speed for New York, using its speed for protection. And on the top left, you see a photo of Queen Elizabeth on that maiden voyage. In a unique maiden voyage with no passengers and a minimal crew, she arrived in New York unannounced in March of 1940, was docked next to Normandy and Queen Mary, and was dubbed the Empress Incognito by the press due to her secretive arrival. For 2 weeks, the 3 largest liners in the world were together for the only time. And if you look in the top center photo here, you see those 3 ships together. From left to right is Normandy, Queen Mary, and Queen Elizabeth. At the end of 2 weeks, the Queen Mary sailed for troop ship duties in Australia. In November, the Queen Elizabeth also left for troop ship duties. Normandy languished until being seized by the US after we entered the war. Conversion to a troop ship named USS Lafayette began, but on February 9, 1942, she caught fire and was flooded with so much water from fireboats that she capsized at her pier. And on the top right is a photo of Normandy on fire, and the lower left is Normandy capsized at her pier after the fire. Many proposals, including conversion to an aircraft carrier, were considered, but as the war progressed in favor of the Allies, the need for her diminished. The pier, where she was, vital to wartime efforts, needed to be cleared. In what became the largest maritime salvage effort until 2013, she was righted and moved to a Brooklyn dock. And you see on the lower center photo here, her gradually being raised, and on the lower right, the remains of her being moved to the Brooklyn dock. So completion of this represented 4 months of painstaking and dangerous salvage work. And it is remarkable that during this dangerous work, not a single death was occurred. And a side benefit was that the salvage was used to train the majority of US Navy divers during the war. Normandy was sold to a scrap company, and by October 1947, the ship most people considered the greatest ocean liner ever built was gone. Liners sometimes operated in convoy with each other during the war, but often sailed alone, relying on their speed to avoid or escape any enemy warship. Many liners contributed to this effort, but I'll focus on the 2 queens as samples. For the first 2 years of the war, the queens transported troops of the British Empire to numerous locations such as Egypt, Africa, and Scotland. In late 1942, the queens began transporting American troops to England in preparation for the D-Day landings of June 1944. And you look on the top left is a photo Some of these American troops on Queen Mary, they're packed in there with their standee bunks there. And on the lower left are the troops lining up for chow in the Queen Mary's first class dining area, which I'd showed you previously in peacetime. In October 1942, Queen Mary, as she approached Scotland on one of these transport voyages, collided with the escorting cruiser HMS Curaçao, cutting her in half and sinking her. And you see a painting of that on the top right. Troop ships were under strict orders not to stop under any circumstances, so the Queen Mary continued on and later had the damage repaired in Boston. The capacity of the Queens was gradually increased from about 2,000 to 5,000 to 10,000 to the point where they routinely carried 12 to 15,000 troops, so an entire Army division. In July 1943, the Queen Mary carried the greatest number of people ever on a ship, 16,683. So you can imagine that just these two ships gave the Allies a huge advantage where they could transport an entire Army division from North America to England in the space of about 6 days and do that over and over. Now in the center, you see a photo of Queen Elizabeth on one of these troop ship voyages. Now there's a lot of troops on deck. There weren't always that many up there on deck. They would rotate times on deck to get fresh air. And then on the lower right, you can see them packed on the bow of Queen Mary. During World War II, the Queens transported more than 2 million soldiers. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill estimated these two ships shortened World War II by a year. Their value was so great that Adolf Hitler had offered a $250,000 reward and the Iron Cross to any German captain that sank one of them. When World War II ended, similar to what happened after World War I, the liners returned to civilian service. There was compensation for ships lost, such as France receiving the former record holder, the German liner Europa, and after redesigning her, renamed her Liberty. And you see her on the top left as the French liner. The Queen Mary continued transporting troops, brides, and families until September of 1946, when work began to return her to passenger service. The Queen Elizabeth was converted first and began service at that time. And on the lower left is a famous photo of Queen Mary arriving in Southampton, England, just having completed her last troop ship duty, with the nearly complete Queen Elizabeth in the background. Despite growing air travel between North America and Europe, the 1950s and early 1960s was another golden age for transatlantic travel, aided by a strong American economy, a recovering Europe, and a growing tourist trade. New York Harbor was often crowded with liners as passenger trade remained strong. And you can see a photo on the right of New York Harbor during this time. It was estimated that the two queens earned $50 million a year during this time. Seeing the critical role liners played in World War II, the United States decided that it needed a ship equivalent to the two queens. This opportunity fell to America's greatest and best-known naval architect, William Francis Gibbs, and you see him on the top left. For 3 decades, he had dreamed of and worked toward building a large, record-breaking liner that would be uniquely American and would sweep all competition from the Atlantic. Now, he was a very interesting person because personally, professionally, and patriotically, he found it offensive that prominence in his chosen field of work fell to Europeans, and he was determined to change that situation. He was a self-taught naval architect Early in his career, and without a set of blueprints, he led the total overhaul of the former German liner Vaterland when it was awarded to the U.S. after World War I. And you see in this center photo here, him working on that project. It is estimated that his firm constructed or designed 2/3 of the Navy's ships during World War II. His contribution to the war was such that he appeared on the cover of Time magazine in 1943, and you see that cover there on the top. This remarkable man created a remarkable ship, the United States. Partially funded by the Pentagon, she could be converted into a troop ship for 15,000 troops in 48 hours, and was a technological wonder. Safety features and survivability were paramount in her design. Because she was considered a military asset, details of her construction and performance were highly classified. As an example, to keep the shape of her underwater hull from view, she was constructed in a unique way, in dry dock. And you see a photo on the top right of her in dry dock. On her maiden voyage in July of 1952, she easily took the blue ribbon, beating the Queen Mary's time by 10 hours and averaging 35.5 knots, which was almost 41 miles per hour, finishing the voyage in a storm while running at only 2/3 power. The first totally air-conditioned ship, she proved immediately popular, capturing a large segment of passenger trade, including the British Duke and Duchess of Windsor, who shifted their allegiance from the British Queen Mary to the American United States. Quite a statement. 71 years later, she still holds the record for the fastest crossing of the Atlantic Ocean. Things were changing in the transatlantic travel industry. In 1957, a milestone was reached, as many people crossed the Atlantic by air as by sea. On October 4th, 1958, an ominous event occurred, the first transatlantic passenger jet flight. People could now cross in hours instead of days, leading to a rapid decline of the liners. By the late 1960s, most liners were gone. The Queen Mary, perhaps the most famous ship in history, made her last departure from Southampton on October 31st, 1967, having completed 1,001 crossings over 31 years. The Queen Elizabeth was withdrawn the next year in 1968, and the United States followed in 1969. Queen Mary was sold to the city of Long Beach, California, where she has been a hotel and convention center since. And you see her there on the top left in Long Beach. The Queen Elizabeth was bought to be used for the same purpose. Spent 2 years in Port Everglades, Florida, then was bought by a Hong Kong businessman to convert her into a floating university and cruise ship. During the final days of her conversion, arsonists set fire to her, and she sank in Hong Kong harbor. And you see the photo on the lower left of Queen Elizabeth burning in Hong Kong. The United States experienced several attempts to have her sail again, most recently in 2016. Currently owned by the SS United States Conservancy, she has been docked in Philadelphia since 1996. And you see a photo of her on the top right in Philadelphia. So if you ever find yourself driving along I-95 through Philadelphia, as you come around and begin to parallel the Delaware River, if you look to your right, you can see the United States. It's very hard to miss. Now, this photo on the lower right, Susan Gibbs, who is William Francis Gibbs's granddaughter, the man who designed the ship, is the SS United States Conservancy's executive director, attempting to save the ship through a commercial venture for a convention center, hotel, and museum. Ocean liners remain the largest moving objects ever built by man. They raced each other for the business benefits and the honor of being the fastest. They were the vehicles which provided ties between Europe and North America, helped win wars, and were the means of the largest human migration in history. Though they are gone, they played a major role in and became a part of the culture of Western civilization. So that is the end of the story. So if anyone has questions, be happy to answer them.
Blane, you are amazing. This presentation is amazing. The photographs are amazing. So we've got lots of comments thanking you and for sharing your knowledge. The one question that I have so far is, when people started cruising for luxurious holidays, was speed something the liners still wanted to achieve?
No, some of the as I mentioned, some of the early ships were, cruised part-time, and some of them were capable of speed, but speed wasn't the main attraction there. It was more of the destination and the voyage, kind of like it is now. So they experimented, some lines experimented with that part-time, and even the United States, which you see on the screen there, did a few cruises, but yeah, speed was not the issue that it was in the heyday.
Okay. Any explanation as to why arsonists burned the Queen Elizabeth?
No, that they've never solved that. They had a lot of laborers working on that ship, and it remains a mystery to this day, really. Yeah, there's some theories and whatnot, but none of those have really been proven.
And I just wanted to share with you and with our guests, a couple of comments that came in during the presentation were that one of our guests, their father, worked during World War II on a ship that delivered fuel to other ships. He was a chief engineer in the engine room. They were given hazard pay because it was easy to be blown up.
Oh, yeah. So that may have been the Merchant Marine, which really did a lot of really dangerous work and critical work with supplies such as fuel and other things.
And I have another guest that came home from World War II on, whoops, I just lost it, on the Queen Mary.
Oh, okay.
And some folks whose families took trips on the USS United States.
Oh, okay, nice.
So lots of interesting comments.
Yeah.
Another question is, would it be accurate to say most US troops who served both in England and Europe during World War II went on one of these liners?
Well, I would say many of them did. However, there were other ships like the Navy operated transport ships. So many of the troops went that way as well. And at the end of the war, there was something called Operation Magic Carpet, which they utilized a lot of ships, including warships, to try to return troops home as quickly as possible. Yeah, so it was a combination of these commercial ships as well as Navy ships, troop transports. Yeah.
And we've got another, thank you for your passion on ships and your expertise. We've learned that our grandmother cruised on the USS United States on one of her last voyages.
Okay.
And Suba, I think I've got all the questions. Did you see anything that I may have missed?
Yeah, one came a little bit late. Were icebergs a concern for these ships? We knew it was a concern for the Titanic. Were they also a concern, Blane, for these other ships?
Oh, yeah, very, very much so. And even today. And so, it's still a concern. But one of the things that came out of the Titanic sinking was what became, it's called something different, which escapes me now, but like the International Ice Patrol or whatever, but trying to monitor these huge icebergs to alert ships so that they could shift their track to avoid them. Yeah, so it's still, ice and fog and heavy seas and things like that are still concerns. And a prime example is the sinking of the Andrea Doria in 1956, which had very modern radar, which, Titanic and ships of that era did not have, but still an accident occurred in fog and through misunderstanding, and that ship ended up sinking.
One other interesting comment, one of my grandmothers sailed on the Queen Mary, and I still have menus and other papers from that voyage.
Oh, that's nice. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. And a friend of mine, he likes to troll these auction sites and whatnot. And periodically he'll send me a link to some ocean liner piece that's being auctioned. So there's many things out there, including from Normandy, because a lot of the furnishings were removed from the ship upon conversion to the troop ship, and they were in a warehouse for a while, then were auctioned, but some of them have been kind of scattered around. And there's some medallions from one of the huge doors on the ship that are actually on the doors of a church in Brooklyn.
One more. When we were in Quebec City a few years ago, we saw another cruise ship named the Queen Mary. So another has been built and given the same name, correct?
Yeah, so that's the Queen Mary 2.
Okay.
Yeah. So much larger, believe it or not, than the first Queen Mary, but very popular ship. Yes.
Well, thank you, Blane. I appreciate the fantastic knowledge you have, but yes, there will be recording will be sent to everybody. There's a question there, but on behalf of ARP Virginia, again, thank you so much, Blane, for your knowledge about it. Was a fantastic program today. We'd love to get your feedback. That's already been posted on there by Ms. Sultani as ideas for future programs. In the chat box, you'll see a link to a survey. Please click on the link and take a few moments to share your feedback with us. I learned a couple of interesting things today. I knew coal was used, Blane, but I never realized till you showed me that photo or showed us the photo how much coal was used. And I also knew troops were transported, especially British troops, but I didn't realize it was up to 15, 16, the record, as you said, 16,000. When I saw those troops on those ships, that was just fascinating to me. That many troops were transported on these ships. I always thought it was maybe 5,000, 6,000. So I always like to learn a few new things.
Yeah, it's really remarkable. So
it is. Anyway, folks, our Tuesday Explorers programs will continue next week, and we invite you to join us. So next Tuesday, it'll be an interesting presentation titled "When the American Nazi Party Prowled Arlington, Virginia." Time period is 1958 to 1983. So, of course, join us again next Tuesday, which will be the new month, April the 4th. Time's going by fast at 3 o'clock. In the chat box, you'll see a link to register for our upcoming programs, www.aarp.org/virtual VA. So until next time, we encourage you to stay curious and keep exploring. Thank you for everybody for joining us. And thanks again to Blane.
Yeah, my pleasure.